Wir sind auf eine lange Schlacht vorbereitet. Aus ganz Europa treffen mit Zügen Truppen und Vorräte ein. Wir rücken langsam vor, Schwelle für Schwelle, Schiene um Schiene. Sie sind unsere Skalpelle, die in das Herz Frankreichs stechen. Wir werden dieses Land aufschneiden und ausbluten lassen. Diese Offensive hat einen Decknamen, Operation Gericht. Ich weiß, dass diese Schlacht diesen schrecklichen Krieg beenden wird.
Arriving in Verdun in May 16, after the big rush, we had a long way to walk to reach our trenches, which were in very bad conditions. They have been bombarded, and many dead soldiers had not been yet buried. We had to do it.
Verdun survit dans le hurlement des obus. Un énorme rideau de fumée noire s'étend comme un voile sur l'enfer.
Un barrage d'artillerie de cette ampleur ne peut signifier qu'une chose. Il va se dérouler ici une bataille comme le monde n'en a pas souvent vu. Des déserteurs allemands ayant franchi nos lignes nous ont dit que toutes les permissions avaient été annulées et que quelque chose de terrible se préparait. À la fin du tir d'artillerie, 2 hommes sur 5 avaient été enterrés vivants dans leur abri. C'est le chaos, la fumée, le bruit, le danger. Nous n'avons plus aucune communication avec le commandement. Nous ne savons plus quoi faire.
C'est à croire qu'1 million d'obus explosent simultanément. Comment ne pas avoir peur ?
We had to run, of course, the Voie Sacrée of Verdun, going from Bar-le-Duc to Verdun. There was the single road going to Verdun, and day and night, without any stopping, there were lorries going on and coming back, going on with soldiers, bombs, food, and coming back.
We could hardly sleep. All my soldiers were sleeping in the mud because they were so tired they couldn't do anything else. The trenches was full of soldiers waiting for the German assault. We naturally were very nervous. And the bombardment began at twilight, and for 72 hours we had a bombardment which did not cease except for a few minutes in the early hours of every morning. The noise was absolutely tremendous. Shells fell all over the place, and there were hardly ground where a shell had not fell.
The attack was like this. Always early in the morning, we received an order to get up, a good glass of coffee with rum. It was necessary to have some spirit, because we knew that above the trench, just above, it was death by bullets which were waiting for us. We had to keep quiet, a whistle order, and everybody ought to jump on the ladders. Sometimes we were obliged to push some soldiers who could not jump on. It was an awful thing, you know.
When the wind was in our favor, we could smell ether from the German soldiers, ether with which they were practically drunk in order to make the assault more effective. On our side, we were given brandy to pep us up.
Life was this. From the beginning of the day until the night, we were eating sometimes and smoking, firing at the German. Sometimes we received a few bombs, and that was the life.
It was very hot in Verdun this summer, and I remember that one evening, beside other things, we had for supper salted herrings, which made us very thirsty, especially on account of the difficulty we had to obtain water. We were not provided with water, we were only provided with wine. But the water we had to find out by ourselves. Try to find a spring or get water out of a bomb hole. I remember for a while we have been taking water from a small rivulet, and one day, looking for a missing comrade, I went to the spring. The body of my comrade was in the spring. We were drinking the water all right.
Of course, we had to live on reserve food, biscuits and chocolate and corned beef and so on.
The food supply came quite irregularly because we had to ask for volunteers to go in the mud under the bombardment to get our food.
Sometimes some soup and coffee could arrive if the men that had gone to fight them were not killed on the way, which was not often that we could go and come back without being killed.
We had bombardment nearly every day, sometimes the whole day, sometimes the whole night. Our shelters were very poor. We couldn't expect to escape with that kind of shelter. We had just to creep in the mud and try to find a bomb hole, not full with water, with rain.
It was like a landscape in the moon.
You could see, especially at night, in the dark, the light of the German guns and the light of the shell exploding. Various colors, blue, the red, the yellow, the orange, any kind, it looked like fireworks.
The smell was curious enough. After a while, I realized what it came from. It was a sort of a sweety smell and acid too, and of course this was the smell of old corpse.
It was to get one trench, two trenches. In fact, during 6 months, I may say that we have stayed on the same ground. And however, we have thousands of men who were killed for these few meters of ground. Is not silly. We have just 200 or 300 yards, no more. And we had thousands of men who were killed on account of these awful attacks without any result, any real result, you know. And now, on the top of the Mount of Lorette, you may see a cemetery which is large like a town, German and French.
What we were eager to know is how long we would stay. And we knew that we would be relieved from Verdun when the casualties would come to a certain percentage. I don't remember whether it was 50 or 60% of the troops. And every morning, when a runner could come to the lines, he was asked, well, what are the casualties today? And it's rather cool to think that we had to hope that the casualties would be heavy so that we could leave this hell. It was hell. It was really hell.
During the Battle of Verdun, Joseph Abedi, a 33-year-old French soldier, writes a last letter to his wife before he is killed. Who knows what to expect? The slaughter will begin again. Good luck to he who will resume his life after battle. Kiss our child for me. Be brave, my darling Sophie. 1,000 farewells. 34-year-old German soldier Fritz Mosler writes, My dearest sister, I can take no more of the horror and the fatigue. I don't want to describe what I've lived through here. At times, I'm not sure if I'm dead or alive. Those who make it home safe and sound will owe thanks to God. Has God abandoned these men? Did they have a choice? How did they continue? How did they manage to hold on to their humanity? Through their love of country? Pride? Or their daily ration of wine? What kept them alive? Was it the long-awaited mail that brought a glimmer of hope? Was it the camaraderie? Was it simply luck? Why does this particular battle, the Battle of Verdun, where over 300,000 perished, still resonate so loudly 100 years later?
By the end of 1915, there was stalemate on the Western Front. Germany's mainly defensive posture had cost France alone over 1 million men killed, wounded, or missing. With the opposing trenches stretching from the Channel to the Alps, Erich von Falkenhayn, chief of the German General Staff, looked for an indirect way out of the deadlock in the West. He intended not a major breakthrough, but a battle of attrition in a place the French would never give up, a place into which she would pour all her men and resources. With the French army bled to death, he reasoned, France would no longer have the will to fight, and Britain, isolated, would withdraw. Falkenhayn found such a place in northeastern France. The siege that ensued lasted some 300 days, cost over 700,000 casualties, and by its end, it was difficult to determine an outright victor. For France, this battle has become synonymous with national pride, national fortitude, and the will of the entire nation. It was the place that France rediscovered its identity, and where the seeds of a united Europe were first sown. Along this road in 1916, which became known as the Voie Sacrée, the Sacred Way, 4/5 of the French army came to the defense of Verdun, a small provincial city on the River Meuse, about 260 kilometers east of Paris. Once the lines of trenches had settled into position in late 1914, and with its ring of 20 major and 40 minor forts ringing the town, Verdun stuck out into German-occupied territory like an elbow. Germany had stood on the defensive in 1915, except for local attacks in the two salients, Ypres and Verdun. The defences at Ypres had been forced back closer to the town, but Verdun had held, despite bitter fighting at the base of its salient. Rocroi to the west and Les Epages to the southeast suffered devastating mine attacks in the fight for control of the vital heights. Although the attacks were ferocious, the French held their ground. Despite the devastation wrought on the flanks, Verdun itself had remained a comparatively quiet sector. Indeed, the French commander-in-chief, General Joseph Joffre, did not take seriously the threat of an assault on Verdun, and gradually took most of the men and large artillery pieces away from the ring of defensive forts to reinforce other areas.
In 1914, Joffre had actually ordered that Verdun be abandoned because tactically it made no sense to hold on to it. The local general, General Saraya, just disobeyed orders, refused to obey, and they hung on to it. So Verdun is now the tip of a salient sticking out into German-occupied territory. And Falkenhayn's thinking is, if we threaten Verdun, the French will pour in more and more troops to defend it, and we will kill them. It's as simple as that.
Joffre was very successful in 1914, but he took fright at what had happened to the forts in Belgium and on the edge of France, which had been so heavily beaten into the ground by the Germans that he feared for the forts which France had arranged around her borders over centuries in many ways. And he decided that he would take the men and the guns out of the forts and spread them around the field.
Underestimating the threat to Verdun and the belief that the system of forts was unnecessary to an effective defense was to prove a costly error in judgment, both militarily and personally, for the French commander-in-chief. What Falkenhayn envisioned was a win-win strategy, to be the victors whether they took the city or not. The prize would be the destruction of the French army.
Falkenhayns Strategie von Verdun muss vor dem Hintergrund der Erkenntnis gesehen werden, zu der man Ende 1915 auf deutscher Seite gelangt war, dass nämlich tiefere Einbrüche in die Tiefe des feindlichen Raums höchstwahrscheinlich auf absehbare Zeit nicht mehr möglich sein würden. Dementsprechend kam er zu der Schlussfolgerung, dass es sinnvoll sein konnte, auf einem Schlachtfeld seiner Wahl nur einen geringen Einbruch zu erzielen, der den Gegner dann wiederum dazu zwingen würde, seine Kräfte auf diesen Punkt zu konzentrieren und auch auf diese Weise den gefürchteten deutschen Durchbruch abzublocken. In dieser Situation sollte die günstige Topographie des Geländes nördlich von Verdun zusammen mit der damals noch gegebenen deutschen artilleristischen Überlegenheit dazu beitragen, die französischen Gegenangriffe zu verbluten zu lassen.
Falkenhayn's instrument for the prosecution of his plan was the German Fifth Army, which had been fighting around the salient from the beginning. The Fifth Army commander was the Kaiser's 34-year-old son, Crown Prince Friedrich Wilhelm. A gift to cartoonists, he was known to the Allied soldier as the Clown Prince, or Little Willie.
The Crown Prince Wilhelm often gets a bad press. He looks like a fop, he looks a bit stupid in many ways. Being the son of the Emperor, of the Kaiser, you couldn't think he was really fully qualified, but he was a much better commander than people realized. He was shrewd, he was far-sighted, and he also was a man who knew when to stop. As the Verdun battle went on, there came a time when the German High Command still wanted to press on and on, but he said, enough is enough. There was a certain basic humanity and common sense about him, and he was actually liked by his men.
The Crown Prince appreciated what Falkenhayn wanted was a limited offensive, not a breakthrough. The destruction of the French forces was to be brought about by bite-and-hold operations. Decimate the French as they defend their ground, and once it's in German hands, crush them when they attempt to retake it.
The Crown Prince would have liked sufficient troops to advance on both banks of the Meuse. Falkenhayn wouldn't give him the troops. He said he didn't have them. He said it was essential to keep back 1/3 of the available German divisions in case of an Allied counteroffensive, which actually probably wasn't going to happen where Falkenhayn said it might happen. Ultimately, of course, we have the Somme offensive. But at the time, Falkenhayn is saying, the Allies will attack up in the north, I must keep the troops back. That was actually nonsense. The real reason was probably that Falkenhayn was worried that the Crown Prince might actually succeed in capturing Verdun. He didn't want that.
There was, however, a note of discord in German planning.
Here we see the difference between the strategist in his office in Berlin and the man commanding the soldiers on the ground. What Falkenhayn actually says in his operation order is that the Fifth Army is to develop an offensive in the Meuse area towards Verdun.
Crown Prince Wilhelm knew you couldn't go and say to your soldiers, sorry chaps, we're just going to waste your way. It doesn't matter how many people you kill or how many people kill you, as long as the battle keeps going. He had to say to them, we are going to take Verdun. There will be a parade in Verdun in 2 or 3 weeks' time. He had to give them an objective to strive for. Otherwise, the soldiers would have just lost heart. So that was his shrewdness as against Falkenhayn's rather, academic ideas, which didn't work in terms of the practical reality of soldiers fighting a battle.
Wilhelm reasoned that he could manage the offensive by making gains, but not actually capturing Verdun, thereby keeping both the strategists in Berlin and the soldier on the ground happy. Forced to concentrate his opening moves on the east or right-flank defenses of Verdun alone, the Crown Prince made his preparations for Operation Gericht, or Judgment. The 12th of February was assigned as D-Day. Villages behind his lines were cleared to accommodate troops. Brought in by about 1,300 trains, 6 days' supply of artillery ammunition, amounting to 2.5 million shells, were stored in dumps. Underground barracks, large enough for hundreds of men, were built, several just a kilometre or so from the French front line. German gains in 1914 had given them control over the major railway centres and provided them with excellent lines of communication. In the new year of 1916, these lines were extended to the fringes of the salient, where a network of narrow-gauge railways penetrated the forests, delivering supplies to the front lines. The Crown Prince assembled some 1,200 artillery pieces around Verdun, over half of heavy caliber, to support about 300,000 infantry. The awesome firepower that he would unleash at the beginning of the offensive was to eclipse anything the French then possessed. The German superiority was in the heavy artillery, including the 13 Krupp mortars of 420 mm, known as Big Berthas.
La bataille de Verdun est avant tout un duel d'artillerie. Les Allemands ont employé une artillerie très puissante depuis la bataille de Verdun. Ils avaient déployé près de 1200 canons pour écraser littéralement les lignes françaises.
Auf französischer Seite hatte man in den Jahren vor 1914 in einem erheblichen Maß auf das neue Feldgeschütz vom Kaliber 75 mm gesetzt, welches 1897 die Einsatzreife erlangt hatte. In vieler Hinsicht ein revolutionäres Waffensystem, war es insofern gegenüber anderen Modellen im Nachteil, als eine hohe Schussfolge durch das Manko einer rasanten Flugbahn aufgewogen wurde. Zur gleichen Zeit standen auf deutscher Seite eine deutlich höhere Anzahl an schweren Mörsern und schweren Haubitzen zur Verfügung, als die französische Armee hätte mobilisieren können. Erst in der zweiten Phase der Schlacht wurde auf französischer Seite dieses Manko graduell ausgeglichen.
Although both sides used tethered observation balloons to track the movements of the enemy and spot the fall of artillery shot, the Germans had a further advantage in that their activities were guarded by the first air force in history to establish air superiority. Not only was it used for photographic reconnaissance, but its fighting scouts prevented French aircraft seeing and reporting on German preparations. The first principles of air combat and the first aces were established over Verdun. Among the famous names to fly over Verdun were the French aces Georges Guillemer and Jean Navarre, whose red colour scheme was later copied by Baron Richthofen. For the Germans, there was Oswald Wölke. Flying for France in the Volunteer American Squadron, later renamed the Escadrille Lafayette, were Victor Chapman and Raoul Lufbery. For the opening offensive, Germany had collected together the largest force of aircraft yet seen in the air war. They gathered in 168 machines, 14 observation balloons called Drachen, and 4 Zeppelin airships. The Germans had the world's first true single-seat fighter at Verdun. The Fokker E-1 Eindecker had a high kill rate by virtue of its machine gun being linked to an interrupter gear, which fired through the wooden propeller without damaging the blades. After less than 2 weeks, though, the French, in the guise of the Groupe de Cigogne, the Stork Squadron, with their skill and élan, took control of the skies over the salient. 120 French aircraft had quickly been flown in. The initiative then passed back and forth between the two pioneering groups of aviators until mid-May, when the French built up their squadron strength to over 220 machines, including the new Nieuport 11 Bébé. The Germans were unable to match these numbers at Verdun. While Joffre was busy redeploying forces and planning the 1916 Allied offensive on the Somme, one man was mindful of the threat that German forces posed to the vulnerable salient. In the Bois des Corps, on the right bank, a French frontline soldier and parliamentary deputy, Colonel Émile Drian, had been worried by the lack of preparation for what he saw ahead. He wrote of his concerns, and his letter was passed to General Gallieni, the War Minister.
Député, engagé volontaire, le colonel Drian a fait un rapport à sa hiérarchie, mais également au Parlement, sur les faiblesses de la fortification de Verdun, alors que lui-même avait très bien senti qu'il s'agissait là d'un point majeur. N'ayant pas été écouté par Joffre, qui lui avait toujours à l'esprit la Somme,
Joffre, furious that one of his subordinates had gone behind his back and not through proper channels, refuted Drian's charges. However, he was soon forced by events to revise his opinion.
Joffre finally accepts that Verdun really is under threat, and on the 12th of February, he gives the garrison 2 more divisions. Now, he was very lucky, because the 12th of February was the day the attack was supposed to start. But because of terribly bad weather and snow, it's actually postponed until the 21st of February. So once he accepts that there's a problem, it takes him a long time, once he does accept there's a problem, then he starts to move.
For 9 days, the Germans had waited in snow, frost, and fog. The morning of the 21st dawned bright and clear. At 7:15 a.m., a shell from a 38-centimeter naval gun exploded in the courtyard of the Bishop's Palace in Verdun. More shells followed, hitting the railway station and the town. The principal heavy artillery action, though, took place on the French first lines of defense, in the woods and hills facing the Germans. The West Bank also received its share of shelling, so that the French would not be sure where the assault, when it came, would take place. Between 7:15 a.m. and 4 p.m. lay nearly 9 hours of the most severe and sustained bombardment yet seen in warfare. 850 guns were dedicated to wiping out the French positions on the right bank sector of only 12 kilometers. That morning, Colonel Drian gave his wedding ring to his Batman for safekeeping and made his way to his bunker, R2, in the Bois des Corps. As he was giving his orders, the world erupted around him. From his bunker, he saw the defenses which were so important to the security of his wood obliterated. In the first hour of the bombardment, 80,000 shells fell on the Bois des Corps alone. Drian's devastated vista was repeated across the whole 12 kilometers of defenses on the right bank.
People used to describe the artillery bombardments of the Verdun as though they were sort of great hands striking down at the soldiers. It was a terrible presence. Artillery became feared and hated at Verdun. In fact, soldiers on both sides, the infantry, had more sympathy with each other than they had for their own gunners. The French and the German infantry were, as it were, in the same boat, being pounded into the ground by this terrible weight of artillery.
By 8 o'clock, those French gunners who had escaped the German artillery and intense gas barrage could do little to help their infantry by counter-battery work. The few French spotter planes to get through the German scouts reported that it was impossible to spot individual batteries, as there were so many. They said the woods hiding the German guns were enveloped in one continuous sheet of flame.